This podcast is made possible by your support and your donations. Thank you. And by the purchase of my book called Everyday Buddhism, Real-Life Buddhist Teachings and Practices for Real Change. I will post an affiliate link to the book on Amazon in the show notes. And if you've already read it, please take a minute to rate and review. And also consider purchasing it again for a friend or family member as a gift. Welcome to Everyday Buddhism, making every day better by applying the proven tools found in Buddhist concepts. Welcome to episode 98 of Everyday Buddhism, making every day better. What a delight it is to have James Cruz joining me for a conversation about the book, The Wonder of Small Things, Poems of Peace and Renewal, which he edited. James is the author of the essay collection Kindness Will Save the World, and editor of several best-selling poetry anthologies, including The Wonder of Small Things, Healing the Divide, The Path to Kindness, and How to Love the World, which has over 100,000 copies in print. James has been featured in NPR's Morning Edition and in People magazine, the Boston Globe, the New York Times magazine, the Sun magazine, and the Washington Post. He is the author of 4 prize-winning books of poetry, and his poems have appeared in Ploughshares, The New Republic, and other journals. Being held and awed by the poems in the book, The Wonder of Small Things, was a special gift for me. But being able to talk with James about the poems, about poetry in general, and to hear him read a few from the book was an even bigger gift. As you will no doubt hear, James is a gentle soul whose conversation about poetry, spirituality, and about life is healing. His words and the tender way he speaks them is a balm for our painful and anxious times. Among other things, we talked about how we turn to poetry during difficult times like these precisely because, as James expresses it, quote, poems are such small but spacious containers that hold so much with just a few powerful sensory details, unquote. And he says, quote, poetry heals because it is so embodied, unquote. And about poetry as spiritual practice, because it focuses us on a non-conceptual awareness of the world around us as it is now. And about poetry, how poetry makes the ordinary become the extraordinary. And how poets do what they do with language, incorporating surprises and opposing feelings and ideas to stop and make us reflect and feel. How poetry helps us transcend dualistic thinking by holding opposing ideas simultaneously and playing with how they interact. And how poetry creates connection and compassion by sharing the feelings and the experiences of others and of all things, including trees, rocks, and even fences. Or, as James expressed it, so many poems have little window moments that we can look through into our own experience. Take some time to ease into this episode. I promise you will be soothed and come away craving more poetry in your life, even if you've never appreciated it before. The conversation starts now. Hello, James Cruz. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hi, Wendy. Thank you so much for having me.
Um, and also I gotta say, thank you for escorting me into the deeper connection to poetry that I've had off and on my whole life, but sometimes you get off of it and you don't do it. And I always forget how what a first of all, it's a spiritual practice. It's a wonderful spiritual journey, and it heals me, especially during these dark times. Um, I've had your book, which, nobody can see because this is not a video podcast, but it's the most beautiful little book. And I take this book as you see how many poems I almost wanted you to read, James, but
Yes.
we don't have. I had to limit it down, but he's going to read some poetry for us later on. But so I've had the book as a constant companion from room to room. And I pick it up once in a while just so that I can, pause and reflect and find new things to think about and discover and get myself out of my little conceptual story spinning in my head, and it's just wonderful. And I wanted to say that it's been, I'm going to use a quote from a review I found from a reader on Amazon. And I think this says it all. It's an instant zap of serotonin for those of
Mm.
us needing a reminder about the awe-inspiring things happening around us every day. Um, I love that quote, and
Yeah.
that's how it feels to
Mm.
me. I think poetry does that anyway, but this 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 compilation is just great, and it's a lot of nature, and I love nature, and so it's just a wonderful thing. But speaking of dark times, I hate to start here, but
Mm.
why we might as well. It's the elephant in the room, I think, on a lot of these things. So let's just look at it. I know you from reading more about you, getting after I got to know you through your poetry, have had a personal dark times recently due to loss. And you don't have to get into that, but I know we've all suffered through our own personal losses, but we've also suffered through cultural and group and global losses in the last few years that have been really hard, I think, for most people to find their way out of, to find hope, to find awe, to find joy, to find all those things that really poetry can give us,
Mhm.
or that zap of serotonin, if you will. Um, so with the climate change and the pandemic and now the wars and all the political, racial, and ethnic divisiveness, and on and on and on. Can you as a poet and as an
Mhm.
editor of poetry, can you speak to how poetry heals us?
Mm. Yeah. Well, thank you, Wendy, for all that you've said so far, and for bringing me into this space with you. I think that's a big question because it is true that poetry can heal us, and I have often wondered why, especially during these past few years of global challenge and also personal challenge. Last year, I lost both of my grandmothers, my dear mother, who died very suddenly at the age of 64,
Oh,
and I turned, even though I'm a poet and I'm an editor of poetry, I've put out several anthologies. Once again, I found myself just needing and craving poetry at that time. And I think it's because poetry is so embodied. And the poems that I really love that I included in this new book, they are so physical and they're so filled with sensory details, details like you said about nature, this planet, this aching, hurting planet that we're living on together, trying to save together. And I think we just in these times when we're often communicating via screen or feeling disconnected or somewhat isolated from each other. We need ways to reconnect with our senses and also with our sense of wonder, awe, joy, kindness, hope, all of these qualities. I feel like they're all qualities that are trying to get at the same essential ingredient, which really is just a deeper presence and connection to each other and to our bodies and to the earth.
Yeah, I think the thing that you said here that really stopped me, what you just said, is that longing to be closer to each other and embodied. I know I've gone through I've gone through trauma, as a lot of my podcast listeners know, in the past few years, that the pandemic sort of triggered past traumas that I honestly didn't even know I had, and I'm 70 years old. So, and one of the things that I found that has been the most healing in dealing with trauma, and in your case, like loss, and a lot of us have had suffered loss during these past few years, is the sense of embodiment. We really lost touch with that, I think, is in and it's the sense of embodiment, like you said, with the earth, with nature, and with each other. The we haven't hugged, for so long, and it used to be, I like personally, I meet up with my best friend every month and we give big hugs, and that's kind of stopped happening, and we're trying to get it back as much as we can. I have an autoimmune disease, so I can't go to places a lot if there's COVID activity and so forth. So it's like hugging is so important, and poetry can hug you. Definitely. And so that was one thing that maybe I missed, is that, I mean, I knew about the awe and the wonder and the joy and the nature, but just that embodiment feeling is like, and being together. And wow, poetry does bring you to, it doesn't just bring you together. When I read a poem, I feel who that person is. We don't know how we connect, because we may not all connect the same way to the same poem. It brings up different memories for different people, or different
Yeah.
whatever, but all of a sudden you are connected to that poet. So thank you for sharing that, because I think that's really an important part of it.
Yeah. Well, I love what you're saying too, Wendy, about I've never heard it put that way. The poetry can hug you. And it's like, yes, of course it can. That's what it does. It embraces you. I think in part because the best poems are embracing the moment,
Yeah.
right as it is. And so many of our moments include joy and sorrow. They include the wonder and awe, but they also include the grief, the larger grief of the world and what's happening right now, the personal griefs that often coexist. And I think, you also got at so many things that we are facing in terms of our own kind of personal challenges, traumas being triggered by what's happening in the world, whether it's the pandemic or war. I know so many people who have had similar experiences of those past traumas or past buried grief just rising to the surface. And I think that poetry helps with that, because there's this sense that even in something that tends to be pretty small and condensed, like, oh, poetry can hold this with me. I almost get emotional talking about
No,
it.
man, me too.
Because it does. It is this larger container that can hold both the personal and the global, and that can hold the traumatic and those little moments of joy and wonder and awe that help us to build the resilience. This is not just sort of like airy talk about what poetry can do. Science has proven that these moments of awe especially just everyday moments. We're not talking about standing at the Grand Canyon or looking up at this giant waterfall or traveling to another country. We're talking about stepping out in the backyard and really looking at what's there, watching, as one of the poems in this book talks about, watching this squirrel after someone has had chemo, and it's just like you come alive after these difficult experiences because you've sort of seen what the other side looks like, and the ordinary becomes extraordinary. And I think that's really kind of the thesis of so many of these poems, and so much of poetry in general, but especially these in The Wonder of Small Things. The poems are really underpinned by difficulty and sorrow in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that is, there's I don't know if it's, you know, particularly Buddhist or specifically or only Buddhist, but there's a saying about having a strong back and a soft front.
Yeah.
It's the way to approach the duality that we face and try to merge it into a non-dual acceptance of both. And in other words, we can live with the coexistence of deep sorrow, deep pain, and wonder at small things. You referenced the squirrel, and I remember that poem, but I also remember what it reminded me of. I I remember it was like the first week after the complete shutdown in the pandemic in March of 2020. And I remember sitting in our 3-season room, and it was starting to get warm, a little bit warm, and it was so warm enough that you could keep the window open a little, because I love to hear the sound of the trees, even if
Yeah.
it's a little cold or whatever, and the birds. And so, and everything was shut down, so I didn't hear cars going up and down the street, and I didn't hear the freeway around the corner, but I just was sitting there, and all the squirrels and the birds were, actively feeding, and like they do in early spring. um and there was such a hubbub, and I remember writing down in my journal, I was writing in my journal, and I remember writing down in the journal that the birds don't know there's a pandemic.
Oh. Mm.
They just, and that just changed me for the whole, maybe probably not a week, but maybe at least a day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it changes you for a moment. I think it's those small realizations, those insights, revelations that really, they may not like stick with us in a conscious way.
Mhm.
But I do think they change our DNA little by little.
Yeah.
It's just like this little switch. And I think that's what poems can do. It just takes something that is typically very ordinary, very everyday, and just shifts it a little bit. So you see it differently. So you see your whole life differently in a way.
Yes, you do. It is. It was such a joyous moment, and a
Yeah.
moment when I was like, like all of us were, not knowing what the next day was going to bring, or how we were going to get through this, or even what the heck it was.
Mhm.
And I said, well, the birds are, just doing what they always do. So, well, I'm good here. So, on the theme of healing, I subscribe to your weekly email, the weekly pause, and all my listeners should too. I'll put the details in the show notes, by the way. And it's one of the few emails I stop and read right away. I get a ton of emails because of the podcast and the saga, and it's like, blah, 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 and every other kind of spammy email. But I have a few that I always just stop and read. Yours is one of them. And I'm always glad I did, even if I'm like thinking I have no time and I really can't get into it right now. And maybe it'll make me cry. And that's probably not a good thing, because I got to meet, So, but I'm always glad I did it. And so it forces me to stop, get out of my head, reflect. It's my favorite kind of meditation, where you're thinking of something, but you're going way, way deeper. And if you don't mind, I'd like to share the weekly pause from this past Friday, November 10th.
Sure.
But I would like you to read the poem at the end. I'll read the intro, but your essays are beautiful too. Okay, this is James. More than ever, perhaps, we see that we have a choice to bless or curse, to find joy or grieve. I try to remember the two can occur simultaneously so that we can embrace the pleasures that come to us, even as we curse the suffering in other parts of the world and in other parts of our life. We can grieve our losses and the larger losses of the human family, even as we welcome the abundance of light on a sunny day, shining through bare trees. I have always felt that we turn to poetry during difficult times like these precisely because poems are such small but spacious containers that hold so much with just a few powerful sensory details. On the day I describe here, I was walking on a trail in the woods near our house, cursing my inability to help those suffering through war and to help myself suffering through the pain of shingles. Poor James. Then the sun suddenly came out, spilling across the forest floor, the very color of clover honey, and I thought, because sorrow and joy rise up in us together, we sometimes get to choose which one we allow to guide this one day, this one life we've been given. Now you have the poem here, and I forgot to tell you I wanted you to read this poem. Do you have it there? Oh,
Yeah.
wonderful.
Choices. You can grieve the leaves stripped from the maple, all that empty space between bare branches, or you can bless the abundance of light shining through, buffing the pine boards of the floor until they turn the color of clover honey. You can mourn the cone flowers now shriveled and brown, say the whole world's gone to ruin, or you can stand at the window, watching the lively yellow blossom of a goldfinch feasting on each crown of seeds, sending more than a few back home, down into the open ground, which knows how to receive them.
Just beautiful. Just absolutely beautiful. And at the end of each one of his weekly pauses, and also in the book, he has this at certain areas of the sections of the book. He invites writing and reflection. And it's wonderful. If you're a journal writer, if you're a hack poet like myself, if you just want to reflect, he offers wonderful reflections. And he in this one he said, write about a time it occurred to you that you have a choice between grief and abundance, resistance and joy. How did it feel to be torn between these two co-arising emotions? And then he does this in the book as well. You might begin in the same spirit as my poem here, writing, you can grieve, with the idea that there's always a choice in what we allow to lead us forward. I just love those reflections because if you are stumped to write in your journal, if you are, or if you just want to reflect on this sort of thing, you really do, I think, capture that spirit. And I loved in the book you do this, and there's always a hook to one of the poems, and that's just wonderful because it's usually I've read the poem and I thought, oh, that was wonderful, and then you reflect on it, it's like, oh, that's awesome. So I wondered about those little hooks or those little reflections. I know you have a practice group or a course, again, which I will put in the show notes. I wondered if you got feedback, if you get feedback about these reflections, like people said, because I'm sure some people want to say, wow, that really helped me or something. Have you gotten audience feedback, reader feedback?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And I'm glad that you mentioned that because I really do see each poem as an invitation to reflect, and that so many poems have these little window moments that we can kind of look through into our own experience. I think that's what poetry wants us to do too. It wants us to look at someone else's specific experience And then, that can be enough sometimes, but it's great to turn it around and say, well, how do I relate to that? When have I had an experience that's similar to that? People do respond to my weekly emails. They're able to do that, and I see those responses. And I always love to see what people did. If they often they're too shy to share what they wrote, but they
Mm.
will say, "Oh, I got something from this morning." Um, in my last anthology, there was a poem of mine, Self Care, and then an invitation to reflect on the practice of self care. And someone I had never met sent me the poem that he wrote from that. And I ended up including that in this current book because it felt to be about wonder and really taking that time. The poem just really blew me away. And so that doesn't happen very often, but I was just so happy that my poem could have a small part in creating this poem that is really about returning to the world, after thinking like, I'm not sure if I can hold on, I'm not sure
Yeah.
if I can keep going. And he realized like, oh, there's still so much to live for.
Oh, that's a oh, I didn't even expect a wonderful story like that. That's just perfect. Um,
Yeah.
I've always loved reading and writing poetry. Like I said, I consider myself a hack poet. But writing is a wonderful practice, in being present to life as it is, and to um it's one thing to read poetry if you try to write it, or try to write even a reflection, even if you're not
Mhm.
trying to craft a poem, but writing a reflection like that spun off of one of these poems. It's like when you have to write something, when you're trying to write something, you have to bring yourself into this sense of non-conceptual awareness. You
Yeah.
can't think it out. You can't, like, okay, I'm going to write a poem about this using these words. That'll never work. It can't work. But if you have to kind of go into that, just that sense of awareness, and then you will find that thing that leads with that first line, just by watching that red squirrel jump on my house right now. Then
Mhm.
you'll find that. And it can also take you into a deep exploration of self, and you can discover something that you hadn't put together with something else before. And
Yeah.
see, it's in these ways that, and here I'm going to tie it to my everyday Buddhism audience, because I'm thinking maybe not everyone is a admirer of poetry, but maybe, I don't know.
Well, they should be.
They're going to be now. They're going to be
That's
now.
right.
We're going to make it happen. So, but in all those ways, for me, poetry is as deep of a Buddhist spiritual practice, or just a spiritual practice, than any I've ever engaged in. And I think it's very Buddhist as well as contemplative Christian. I think it's
Yeah.
because it's contemplative. Um, and I think it is very undervalued as a spiritual practice. It's
Mm.
rarely talked about as a spiritual practice. You have talked about it as a spiritual practice in some of the things I see that you write. But maybe it's because I think a lot of people consider it so, ooh, how should I, literary.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? And out of touch with the everyday. And I think people, they had to read Beowulf in eighth grade, but then they didn't know that poetry could be like this now. They didn't, you see what I'm saying? They don't,
I
I think
do.
that's
Yeah.
what happens. And I know you don't feel it's out of touch with the everyday. I know you, because it's all about the everyday. Can you talk more about that? Because it's everyday Buddhism. I'm talking about it as a spiritual practice. And to me, it is about the everyday.
Yeah. It is. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. There's a phrase that I use in I think it's the previous anthology, The Path to Kindness. There's a poem about a woman who's folding her family's clothes, and she's imagining them wearing them and they're still warm from the dryer. It's again one of these really physical poems, and it has an invitation, a writing prompt that comes with it. And I called it the sacred everyday,
Oh, well,
because
that's great.
like who really loves folding laundry or doing dishes or
Right.
sweeping the floors? I mean, maybe some people out there do, but it's not my favorite thing. But I think when we can really go a little deeper and pay more attention and see, a little more deeply, then the act becomes sacred. I think anything we give our attention to becomes more
Yeah.
sacred as a result, right? And so I definitely see it that way. I do see writing as a form or, part of spiritual practice. I think it's just another one of those tools in the tool belt that we have for connecting with a contemplative life or the life of the spirit, and also with processing trauma, pain, and grief that can sometimes block us from having access to,
Yeah.
the larger spiritual life and that connection that we're all seeking. And so I think for me, my mindfulness meditation practice is very tied to writing practice. And I'm a writer, but it's hard to put it into words exactly. I think it's just partly what you were saying, this idea of having, accessing non-conceptual awareness, and really that's why we call it a writing practice, like just practice doing that. And the way I usually frame it is sort of like meditation. When I sit on the cushion, I have no idea what's going to arise or
Right.
what's going to come up. And I try to note that, do my best to welcome it. There may be some resistance. And it happens now that I do the same thing when I'm writing. So what I set out with when I'm maybe working on a poem is, by the time I get to the end, completely different from
Yeah.
I don't even try to guess anymore, Wendy. Like I just allow myself to be surprised. And now, even more than creating something that can be shared, that can be published, I'm creating something so that I can be surprised.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's what I'm doing also with the anthologies. So gathering other people's work that has surprised me somehow, that allows me to feel held and embraced, allows me to see the everyday as sacred, the ordinary as sacred, but also that really surprises me, even if it's in a small way.
That's the thing. I that's what I love about poetry. I think I mentioned this to you in a previous email we shared. Is that's how um, poems remind me of koans,
Mm,
because koans have surprises. That's the whole point of a koan, is a surprise. It's a surprise to knock you out of your conceptual mind and say, "Gee, I don't know." And then to work with that. A poem can do that too in the same way, because it has all that. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And pardon me while I explore a few of the connections I found between Buddhism and poetry. I'm going to just list off a few because I want my listeners to to hear this about poetry and think of it as a spiritual practice. But after I share a few of these things, it won't take too long. I'd love you to riff off that on your as a poet, okay? For me, as a Buddhist practitioner, a Buddhist teacher, poetry offers number one, feeling awe, which to me is a sacred space. Awe is like one of my main things. Number two is a heightened and non conceptual awareness of the world around us as it is now.
mm,
Um, Taking us out of tomorrow, yesterday. Also, this is this thing you just mentioned: gaps, surprises, paradoxes, metaphor, and ambiguity. The way a poet uses words and empty spaces, um, which allows a comfortable or uncomfortable, I don't know, mind.
mm,
Sometimes it just opens all into this, and you fall into this space that you didn't know was coming. um, Building connection and compassion by feeling the experience of others, of all and feeling the experience of, like in this book, of like trees and rocks and sometimes things that people consider inanimate. It does help transcend, we talked about this a little bit before, touched on it, help transcend dualistic thinking by holding opposing ideas simultaneously and playing with how they interact in your life, and embracing the impermanence and imperfection of life, helping us accept in a dynamic way, not a resigning way, life as it is, not as we wish it would be, finding rest and contentment in things as they are. There's a lot of times I just read a poem and just go, just and exploring what we think, feel, and believe. It's that old, I write to find out what I think and what I'm thinking about. And reading poetry out loud, which is what I'm going to ask you to do in a little bit, has a sacred ritual quality to it, much like chanting. And I don't know if people aren't familiar with poetry readings, they maybe don't know how poetry is read the way James read poems. I remember when I we had a poetry mentor, and we worked for a long time on people learning to read their own poetry, because it's a whole different thing. It's very slow. You don't talk with the sort of like inflection and emphasis that you do, like I'm doing now, or we do in even an essay. So those are the things that I said were the key qualities as a spiritual practice. Can you riff off that a bit, Mr. Poet?
Absolutely. Well, you've given me a lot to work with there, so I appreciate that. I love everything that you listed. I think that's absolutely accurate. What came to me was, what you had said about really connecting not just with ourselves, with others, but also with things that people might consider inanimate. And so seeing our world as alive, even when things seem static, like trees seem static sometimes, and rocks seem static. There's this wonderful Jane Hirschfield poem in which she's watching these deer kind of just pour through this opening in a fence. And the very end, which I have loved for years now, she says, "I have never known such accurate envy." And you think she's talking about the deer, but she says, "Not of the deer, to be that porous, to have such largeness pass through me." So she's talking about the fence. She's envious of the fence with the deer pouring through. And I'm just like, yes. See, that image for me captures what it can feel like to have one of these moments that's so hard to describe and that's so hard to hold in something that is not poetry. So in one of the poems that I'll read, it's me finding this sleeve of ice that's dropped off a tree branch in the middle of winter and just feeling this moment of awe, like I've never seen this before. Or it's someone hugging a tree during the pandemic because she can't hug anybody else,
Yeah.
So I just feel like it's important to emphasize that. And I think all those qualities you mentioned, it also feels like, that sense of rest, that sense of awe, that sense of presence. These are all things that we crave. And I think that we can find them through the act of writing. And so I guess what I'm wanting to emphasize too is that to some degree, we're all hack poets, Wendy. So it's not just you. I feel like a hack poet too.
Oh, yeah.
We're just trying in the moment. In a way, every moment that we sit down to write is fresh and open, and there's just this great sense of possibility. And so I hope that anybody who listening who might have a little tiny pull toward writing, or who might feel like somewhat intimidated by writing or poetry, will know from this book and other things that I've done that there are poems out there that are about everyday things. And I think those are the poems, because they're just about the material of daily life, those are the poems that really give us access to spiritual practice and
Yeah.
experience because we're out there just living our lives. And this is how we take spiritual practice with us, is working with each moment exactly as it is right now. And to go back to what we said before, so many of those moments contain sorrow and joy and difficulty and wonder all at the same time. So if we can kind of connect more with the things, the people around us, I think we have more access to spiritual life in that way.
Yeah, I'm so glad you put a bug in my listener's ear about trying to write a little something about that when they realize, like, there's a poem in this anthology about the dust. Um
Mhm.
how the dust is always there. I love that. I wrote a poem years ago dealing with my perfectionism, and I called it Learning to Love the Dust because I was so worried about keeping a clean house. Um, but then I realized, well, the dust is always there, so I should just learn to love it, you know. And that poem
Mm.
reminded me of that. So, and then total inanimate object, but or maybe not inanimate because I think it might be made up of little bugs and things, but it's the dust is always there. And when when it sparkles in the sunlight, you can either react to it by saying, "Oh my gosh, I got a dust," or you can just watch it sparkle in the sunlight, right?
That's right. Choices,
Yeah,
yes.
choices like, yeah, like your poem. Okay, I know this might be an off the wall question. Um, but here I have a poet in front of me, and I want to ask this question. Now, I think we kind of answered it a little bit before, but I'm wanting you to dig deeper. Is how does poetry grab us the way it does if we take the time to sink deep into a poem? To me, it's as if the poet and I sort of arrive at a mind meld, the Spock mind meld. It's
Yeah.
like a mind, but it's not just a mind because it's not conceptual, it's a mind body meld. And
Yes.
then,
Mm.
all of a sudden emotion will wash over me, or I see something like exactly the way the poet saw it, in a way that maybe I never lived in a place that was a prairie, and this person described a prairie, and
Yeah.
I see it. I can completely see it. And then I'm taken away, if only even for a minute, from my troubles, preoccupations, pain, whatever. And you wrote an essay called The Wonder of Small Things that you had published on terrain.org,
Mhm.
and it's an online journal, and it explained how you feel poetry works. But can you share with us a little of the magic about how it works and how, this sounds stupid, but how do poets do this?
It's not stupid at all. I mean, I may spend my whole life trying to figure that out and put that into words. But I think it is somewhat what we've been talking about a little bit. I think that poets do it by using the everyday material of language. If we speak, even if we don't read, if we speak, we all have access to language. And so poets are using something that we all have access to. I feel that the best poems or my favorite poems are the most accessible. And so you're right that when you read it, you're kind of going into this different voice. But the best poems for me are not necessarily written in this sort of high-minded, I shall go, you know,
Literary.
exactly. I love the air quotes and the literary voice. Yeah, I think they're just written in an everyday voice, in the voice that you might use when you're talking to your neighbor, that you might use when you're talking to a coworker, relative, or partner. And so I think that they seduce us almost,
Yeah.
by that's kind of like, hey, can I tell you something? It won't take very long. And so, you kind of get in. I think the difficulty for some people with poetry is that it's moving. What I like to say it does is it moves at the pace of the soul. And so
Mm,
it's moving at a slower pace than, an online article from the New York Times or something like that. So if you're kind of used to scanning and reading and looking at texts, you might have to adjust for just a moment and say, okay, I'm going to let some of that fall away, because poetry does demand that you let some
right.
things fall away. Like you said with my weekly email, like, even though I don't think I have time, I pause anyway.
That's right.
Right. And so poetry asks you to pause anyway, slow down a little bit, and just take in what the person is saying. It's almost like, this is a weird thing to say, but it's almost like stepping into someone else's body for a
Yeah.
moment,
Yeah.
and like, just come be with me in this bodily experience of watching the dust spin in the air or whatever it is. And and then you're kind of brought out, often gently, led through the moment, and then kind of brought to this other side where you've probably been surprised if the poet's done her work or their work. Um, you maybe see things a little differently. And and I think this has all been done with, probably simple everyday language, maybe a few images that are unexpected. And it also makes me think of what you were talking about earlier with that saying of the strong back and the soft front. I feel like a poem has a really strong back because the poet has given all their attention to this language, this moment, these images. But the soft front also has to be there. So the poem
Yeah.
still has to be porous and open and vulnerable.
Oh,
If
yeah.
if I'm going to let you into my experience, I'm going to have to be really vulnerable and really soft to do that.
Yeah, and that's the thing in writing poetry. And if any, or and anybody who writes in their journal or something, there is that sort of temptation to like make it all logical and make it all fit
Yeah.
together, even though something else busts through, right? That's
Yeah.
very soft and very vulnerable. And
Mhm.
then you're there like being like the internal editor saying, no, 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 I don't want to put that in there. Do you know what I mean? It's like
I do, yeah. Yeah,
it's
I've worked with a lot of people with their writing and their poetry, and I remember this when I was kind of just coming to writing and learning, is you often sit down with a specific idea in your mind. I
mm,
try not to do this now, but it still happens. Of like, oh, this is where it's going to go. This is where I want to end up. This is what I'm trying to say. And I think I love when that something else busts through, like you said. And it does feel like that, feels
it's
sort of violent or sudden, like,
yeah,
whoa, where did that come from? And
exactly.
what I've learned is that's the magic. That's the
Yeah.
gold, is when the something else busts through. And sometimes you don't need to justify it. You don't need to go back and say, well, I've got to like, stitch all these things together to show how I got there.
Yeah.
You just let it be in many cases. And you let
Ah,
it be that surprise, or that, like you said, the long breath at the end of like, oh,
yeah.
where did that, because the reader is saying, where did that come from? How did we get here?
Yeah. That's the ticket, it's like you said, is like it's that busting through thing is to me the magic of the poem because when you do as a writer, you're always trying to um well, how will they know that my father's index finger was crooked? I mean, when I use that image, I might have to explain that, or do
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? It's like
Yeah.
these things come, and you really they just come as if someone else is speaking in your mind or something. It's
It's
like
true.
very strange, like an alien pops out. But yeah, that was really a great explanation of how poets do what they do. And there is I have to say, there is a certain weirdness about spending this much time talking about poetry.
Yeah.
I think it's time we experience it. If it's okay with you, I'd love to I cued him first. I want everyone to know that I didn't just say, okay, these are the four I want you to read. Quick, find them. Um, but I picked four from the book, which was excruciating for me. I
Well, I take that
showed,
as a compliment.
yeah, oh yeah, because I had different color post-its, little post-its. Okay, all these I want to him to read, but I think we better limit it. So then I'll put a yellow on there for the ones that we could probably have time for. So um so I'm going to ask James to read some poems from The Wonder of Small Things, Poems of Peace and Renewal. Like I said, it was nearly impossible, but I chose four. And I'm going to briefly share why I selected each one from my perspective, what they did to me, what they did for me. And then if you could read and share a few words about each one after you read it from your perspective. Okay.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I'm going to start with the one you wrote, awe, um, because as I hinted, for me, one of the most sacred feelings we can have is awe, and you captured it in this poem. So, can you share?
Yes. This is awe. It's a shiver that climbs the trellis of the spine, each tingle a bright white morning glory breaking into blossom beneath the skin. It can happen anywhere, anytime, even finding this sleeve of ice worn by a branch all morning, now fallen on a bed of snow. You can choose to pause, pick it up, hold the cold thing in your hand, or not. Few tell us that wonder and awe are decisions we make daily, hourly, minute by minute, in the tiny offices of the heart, tilting the head to look up at every tree turned into a chandelier by light striking the ice in just the right way. And that poem, I almost feel like that poem was gifted to me. It's you have certain poems that you feel like it's like you described, Wendy, like someone else is speaking in your mind and you are taking dictation, maybe making a few changes here and there. Um, but I actually remember that came after a large ice storm we had here in Vermont. I think it was not last winter, but the winter before. And it knocked out the power. So it was without power, without internet, which was probably why the poem was born in the first place.
Exactly.
I had the space to just sit
Yeah.
down and write without distraction. And yeah, it's just to me, everything about that poem was really surprising. Each tingle of awe being like a bright white morning glory breaking into blossom, climbing the trellis of the spine. I'm like, where did these images come from? I have never thought of the spine as a trellis. That's so strange,
So
but
perfect,
it
though.
feels right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and I love the small offices in the heart.
yeah,
That was the most shocking, surprising little. Everything was so
yeah.
beautiful, and then there were those small offices in the heart. But I got where you were going there. I mean, or
Yeah,
where whoever was speaking to you was going. It was
yeah.
wonderful. The
Thank
next
you.
one I'd like you to read is titled "Sorrow Is Not My Name." And this is sort of in the theme of the sorrow and the dark times we were sharing. And this is by Ross Gay. And this one reminds me to look around at all the sweet and wonderful things around us that are not sorrow, pain, or worries. And the word sweet was used in that poem, and I think that's one of the things that got me. So
Yeah,
James, you're up.
absolutely. So this is Sorrow is Not My Name by Ross Gay, and it's written after Gwendolyn Brooks, who has a poem of the same name. No matter the pull toward brink, no matter the florid, deep sleep awaits, there is a time for everything. Look Just this morning, a vulture nodded his red, grizzled head at me, and I looked at him, admiring the sickle of his beak. Then the wind kicked up, and after arranging that good suit of feathers, he up and took off, just like that. And to boot, there are on this planet alone something like 2 million naturally occurring sweet things, some with names so generous as to kick the steel from my knees. Agave, persimmon, stickball, the purple okra I bought for $2 at the market. Think of that. The long night, the skeleton in the mirror, the man behind me on the bus taking notes. Yeah, yeah. But look, my niece is running through a field calling my name. My neighbor sings like an angel, and at the end of my block is a basketball court. I remember my color's green. I'm spring. Hmm.
Gosh, that thing
Yeah.
is amazing.
Surprise after surprise after surprise.
Exactly.
And yeah. And I think, as I was reading it this time, I love reading this poem out loud, even though I can't quite capture it the way Ross does his own work. Um, I was really struck by the title, Sorrow is Not My Name. So even if I might be in sorrow or feeling sorrow, or even though, he has all these references toward death, the vulture, the
Culture.
sickle, the skeleton in the mirror, like we all live with this every day, but it's not who we are. It's not our name. It's not necessarily the defining feature of being human is that, death and disaster and difficulty might await us. That it is, I think, in his argument, it's about these sweet things, 2
Sweet
million
things.
naturally
Yeah.
occurring,
Yeah.
and these, he's talking about growing things, but then he's also talking about his niece running through a field, the neighbors singing like an angel, the basketball court because he loves playing basketball. These two are the sweet things that are naturally occurring in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And, there were so many images there that reminded me of my life. And I think that's the thing about poetry too, is when there's a lot of different images that people have. You may share many of those, like the basketball court did it to me. I grew up with a basketball court. I had 3 brothers. We had a
Nice.
basketball court. So that I have all these memories around that sound constantly, that
Mm,
of the basketball hitting the court all summer long and my brothers playing with their friends. And it's like it, and then it takes you there, and that's a sweet thing, right? That's
mm.
a sweet thing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even with just a phrase, basketball court, and then you're instantly back in your childhood. Like you said, there's nothing like the sound of a basketball on concrete or pavement like that. That is just so visceral.
It is, it's definitely true. All right, now the next two. And this is, I guess, my little selfish journey. So, it's so wonderful to have a poet here to read my little selfish journey. The next two I picked transported me again back to my childhood. But these
Mm,
things, they happen. You can't help it, right? And it
that's right.
starts with Hugging the Tree by, I don't know, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. It's Zena Azam.
Close. Zaina Azam.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, close. This poem reminded me of how I used to sit for hours leaning against one of the few scraggly trees in my childhood small town yard. We lived next to a bank, but it was a small town. We like maybe 1,000 people lived there, maybe or something. But there was a bank. But that bank was right next to our house
Yeah.
in this small town on Main Street. And they had a little drive-through window. And I would sit though next to that tree all for hours as a child, dreaming, watching ants, looking at birds. And then I always remember the background sounds of a muffled voice of a teller talking through a distorted speaker. Now, I don't know. that hugging that tree, I got it because of the pit. I mean, I understand where they were going, but that's where I went. So that's why I chose it.
I love it. I love it. Well, you're illustrating so well what we've been talking about, which is, you might read a poem that's so specific and then it instantly transports you to your own experience. So I love that happened with this poem. Yeah, so this is Zaina Azam, who is a Palestinian American poet, and this is Hugging the Tree. It was neither part of a protest nor a statement to the world. I simply put my arms around a tall oak and stood in embrace, our bodies juxtaposed. There was no swaying. Her trunk, solid and true, felt like an ancestor, a pillar thick with years. Her bark scratched my skin if I moved, so I stayed still. It was a time to be calm and reflect on our presence together, to look up to the sky and fathom the height of my partner, to inhale the earthy scent, to arc my grateful arms around this strong matriarch and whisper into the wood my wordless secret. I have not hugged anyone for months, my dear tree.
Yeah, that's just it makes
Oh,
you cry.
yeah,
It's hard not to cry on that one, but
yeah.
and I think we can all understand. I don't think I know anyone who hasn't hugged a tree, and actually, I don't think I would want to know anyone who hasn't
No,
hugged a tree.
no, it's true. If you're
That's
not willing to hug a
terrible.
tree or
Yeah.
see it as a living being, I don't know if I can really connect with you or really talk to you on a deeper level,
Yeah, it's
right?
really when you first introduce somebody, do you hug trees? Okay, forget it, we're out. Yeah,
Mhm.
my partner, my wife hugs trees all the time, way more than me. And she always walks barefoot, always, no matter what, even if it's dangerous. And I'm like, jeez, you know, I a
I
lot of
love
times
that.
say, I'm not in the mood to go to the hospital. Can you please put some Crocs on or something?
Yeah,
So
it takes a long time to wait at the ER these days, so let's
that's
not do
right.
that.
Yeah, but I think mostly it's just in our yard. We have a
Yeah.
big yard, but half the time I look out and she's always hugging a tree. So it's like,
Mm.
I guess that's why we're married. She hugs trees. So, and so the last one, which is definitely not least, I made this the last one on purpose.
Yeah.
It's called Reverence. Um, and it's by Julie Cadwallader. Wow, what a name. Staub, which is a tribute to the childhood delight of summer and how to this day, this is my tribute, the sound of cicadas instills deep reverence in me, a worship of her. This is a quote from the poem, the utter certainty of the goodness of life, as the poet writes. I Cicadas do that to me. They're like it's like a spiritual chant. It's like the hum of Tibetan monks. It's like the when I hear cicada, some people don't like that sound. It's loud and it's like
Yeah,
really get into it. It's lovely. It's just
that's right.
it's just lovely. So reverence.
Reverence by Julie Cadwallader Staub. The air vibrated with the sound of cicadas on those hot Missouri nights after sundown when the grown-ups gathered on the wide back lawn, sank into their slung back canvas chairs, tall glasses of iced tea beating in the heat. And we sisters chased fireflies, reaching for them in the dark, admiring their compact black bodies, their orange stripes and seeking antennas, as they crawled to our fingertips and clicked open into the night air. In all the days and years that have followed, I don't know that I've ever experienced that same utter certainty of the goodness of life that was as palpable as the sound of the cicadas on those nights. My sisters running around with me in the dark, the murmur of the grown ups' voices, the way reverence mixes with amazement to see such a small body emit so much light.
Just wonderful.
Yeah.
And we don't even have fireflies around anymore.
Yeah, they are rare. We do have them in Vermont, but it's nothing like I actually grew up in Missouri, so that's why I kind of
Oh, oh,
connected with this
really?
poem. Yeah, just the very hot nights. And my brother and I would run around chasing the fireflies that you just don't see very much there anymore. Um, yeah, and I love that idea of the reverence. It's this sacred sort of prayerful attention that's mixed with amazement, like just pure awe, amazement, and it's something that we feel so effortlessly as children, like you said when you were introducing it. And it feels like it becomes our work then later in life to reclaim that,
Yes.
reverence and amazement that we still have access to, but that we kind of lose touch with, I think, because the muscle doesn't get as much exercise as it did when we were kids,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
And it's just like just the line about running around in the dark, it's like,
Yeah,
do we ever run around in the dark anymore? I mean, I
it's
walk
true.
around in the dark, but I don't run
Yeah,
around in the dark. Yeah, it's just
yeah.
wonderful. Well, I could talk to you for days. I just love this and I could listen to you read, but I don't want to take too much more of your time. And like I said, I'll post the links to all of these things. But before we close, is there anything else you would like to mention that I didn't mention or didn't lead you to?
No, I mean, I really do think that we've touched on everything. This has been a lovely, sacred conversation. I do feel like you experience and see the world as a poet with a poet's soul. Maybe that's the Buddhist in you. But I think there's something else to that. And I think that's something else that we all have access to, that, it's not just poets who can see like this or write like this.
Right.
I truly, because I've worked with hundreds of people over the years, I have seen that people who don't think they have access to that, who don't think they can write, they end up writing things that just amaze me, that really blow me away. And I think it's just having the right examples, having, this whole group of poems in this book that show you there are so many ways to feel that mix of the reverence and the amazement. And like we were saying, it happens in these really everyday moments.
Yes, and you have to trust that thing that burst out of your head while you're writing because it will come if you keep doing it. It's a
Yeah.
practice. It will come, right?
Mhm.
So again, it was so wonderful to talk to you. Thanks again for being here. I know what you shared today will help inspire others to read more poetry, try their hand at writing poetry, and just dip their toes into the healing that poetry offers. It's just a wonderful thing. So thank you so much, James.
Well, thank you, Wendy. I so appreciate it.
That's it for this episode. Now, don't you feel better? I told you you would. But now it's, as usual, some announcements. As I talked about in the last podcast, we recently began a new study in the Everyday Sangha, where you can join me and others in our private donation supported Sangha that meets virtually via Zoom every other week on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. The Sangha is studying the Pure Land Sutras with the book Great Faith, Great Wisdom, Practice and Awakening in the Pure Land Sutras of Mahayana Buddhism by Ratnaguna. Our meetings consist of a service first, including traditional recitations and other invocations like refuge and bodhisattva vows, etc. We do some chanting and have a short 5-minute meditation period. The service introduces more ritual and liturgy into the structure of our meeting, much like you would find at a non-virtual Buddhist temple, church, or sangha. It includes a Dharma talk by one of the practice leaders or myself. and possibly a Dharma glimpse by one of our Sangha members. After the service, we then open it up to discussion of the current book study or of anything that was inspired by one of the Dharma talks or by something one of our Sangha members glimpsed in their life. Consider joining the Sangha at this time to be a part of the relatively new sutra study and a part of our practice and a part of a very warm and welcoming Sangha community. You can learn more about the Sangha by viewing the latest bonus YouTube podcast where me, Bradley Janayo Sensei, and Terry Zenkai Hoskin, our practice leaders, talk about what the Sangha and what everyday Buddhism is all about. You can also support this podcast and the other activities of Everyday Buddhism by becoming a community member for $5 a month. If you do, you will have access to all members-only podcasts, an education series, the Introduction to Buddhism course, and our new Buddhist book club, as well as a private group on a non-Facebook platform. If you don't follow me or Everyday Buddhism on any social media platforms we post in, you can go to the Everyday Buddhism website and join the membership community or the Everyday Sangha. Go to www.everyday-buddhism.com and click on either the tab that says Join Members Community or Join Everyday Sangha. Or you can join through Patreon at patreon.com/Everyday Buddhism. Links to joining the Everyday Sangha and membership community are posted in the show notes. Thanks to all of you who contribute. This podcast, the community, and the Sangha depend on your donations to continue to exist. I do not seek sponsors, and I do not ask for financial commitments through paid podcast memberships. So my work and the cost needed to support what I do is entirely self-funded except for your donations. Please consider a one-time or continuing donation through Patreon or on my website's Donate tab. Or you could buy me a cup of coffee on the coffee cup link on the website. That helps too. You can find all the links in the show notes. And thanks to all of you who write in with comments and questions. As the latest bonus member podcast illustrates, I read your emails and may even pick your question to feature in a bonus podcast. Another way you can help is to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. It's important that you share the podcast with others if you find it helpful in your life. And if you could please take a minute to comment. Don't just rate, but review so people will know why you love Everyday Buddhism. Well, that's all for the announcements. So until next time, keep finding ways to make yours and everyone's days better.